6 years after David Harper vanished deep inside the Nevada woods, his bones were discovered scattered beneath a massive pine. But something wasn't right. The symbols carved into the trees around him looked new, fresh, like someone had just finished writing. Sheriff Randall thought it was just vandalism, until the same markings appeared overnight, circling the old gravesite like the forest was still talking. The air smelled of iron and rain, and from the corner of his eye, he swore he saw someone standing between the trees. Only when his light flickered did he realize it wasn't someone. It was something. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. Ethan Cole liked the quiet that lived just beyond the noise. He was 34, pale from nights behind a camera screen, with hands that knew lenses better than they knew conversation. He worked freelance, wildlife shoots, odd editorial gigs, and when the money, or the mood, or the weather allowed, he vanished into the hills outside Reno. That weekend felt like one of those just because trips, a reset more than an escape. He told his sister where he was going, sent a photo of his tent under low clouds, and wrote, "Back Sunday, probably." That was the last anyone heard from him. You could picture him, boots half-laced, a coffee tin cooling on the tailgate, a camera strap worn soft where his neck met it. He tightened the strap, blinked into the white light of his phone, checked battery, checked the map. Small human gestures, tugging a sleeve, rubbing a sleep shadow from his eye, tucking a loose hair behind his ear, little icons of a man not afraid of being alone. The air that day smelled like crushed sage and riverstone, a dry scent that sticks to your throat. Ethan chose a small clearing by a creek that had almost given up on being a creek. It was more a scatter of stones and stubborn moss, a place where animals passed through rather than stayed. He set his tent near a pine that leaned like an old man listening to the world. He photographed the light as it folded into itself at dusk. Long frames, grainy close-ups of a moth's wing, a silhouette of a coyote at the ridge, and, true to form, he texted his sister one last picture. A snap of orange canvas framed by pine, the caption simple, "Found it." Sunday came and went. Monday turned into an emptier Tuesday. The first 2 days after Ethan failed to check in were the sort you don't notice at first. Calls go to voicemail, messages sit unread, you assume the phone is dead. Then the worry arrives, soft and persistent, like a fly you can't swat. When his sister called the local ranger and they scrolled his last known coordinates, the routine search teams were sent out, boots crunching and radios chattering. People fell into rhythms, search, wait, question, like waves testing a shore. They found his camera close to the campsite, half buried by a gust of sand and the careless foot of something that had passed that way. The lens was cracked, spider-webbed from impact, the strap chewed through in one place. There was a coffee cup tucked under a rock, a page from a notebook with a single note. Mountain cat? And nothing else. No blood, no broken branches that suggested a scuffle, no signs that a bear had made him dinner and gone. Just absence. That kind of nothing is loud, by the way. It presses on your chest, makes you breathe slow and stupid. Neighbors gathered outside the ranger station, voices low but urgent, trading scraps of what they'd seen. An old man who ran the bait shop shrugged and said, "Kid always chased shadows," like that explained something. A woman in a pickup marked apps and rangers' phone numbers, muttering, "Shouldn't have gone in alone, not out there." Little gossip, spare and cutting, folded into the bigger worry, people looking for somebody else's mess to stitch themselves back together. Hikers who had seen Ethan packing up described him as polite, nervous in a way that meant he cared. He'd asked about animal tracks, about where the light hit best. "He seemed like he knew what he was doing," said one. And another countered, "Maybe he did, maybe he didn't." And their voices were like leaves rubbing against each other. Searchers combed the stream bed, circled the pine, widened out into the scrub. They called his name until the sound felt small. They found footprints that stopped at a cluster of stones, patterns blurred by the wind, and a set of prints that suggested a second pair. Two large, animal-like perhaps, but never a definite match. Dogs were brought in. They nosed and whined, then sat down as if confused, their tails slow, puzzled. Two cadaver dogs alerted to something a half-mile away, then balked. The teams marked the place with orange tape, and the rumor mill started. A bear, a wandering miner, bad luck. People offered theories the way they offer help, earnest, often useless. There were nights when the town felt like it was holding its breath. At the diner, over cheap coffee and scrambled eggs, people leaned into the idea of danger like a story you want to believe in, because believing means you can pin blame and move on. He always took risks, someone said, stirring sugar, and another, quieter voice added, young people think it's a dare. The ranger, older, with a jaw that had been set for long things, would only say, we'll keep looking. He rubbed his knuckles, looked at the map, adjusted his hat, micro-movements that masked a kind of professional worry. The official search lasted weeks, then months. Volunteers came and went. The orange tape faded where it fluttered in wind, and the place where Ethan disappeared began to accumulate the soft clutter of abandoned hope. Flowers left by strangers months later, a faded jacket draped over a post, notes folded into creases. The park ranger logged every call, every tip, every shaky sighting. He wrote in neat, precise letters that there was no evidence of foul play, no tracks beyond the ordinary. But his handwriting, if you looked close, trembled on the letters that spelled Ethan's name. Months turned into a year. The more time stretched, the more voices softened into a resigned hum. People stopped coming to the ranger to demand explanations. Instead, they asked smaller questions. Did the creek run dry that summer? Did coyotes move closer to town? Trying to contain the thing that had happened with fact. Yet in quiet moments, when the sun went flat and the desert tasted like memory, conversation folded back into speculation. Maybe he walked off and started a new life, someone suggested once, and another snorted, who goes ghost for that long? They argued, they whispered, they assigned motives like trinkets. And somewhere, beneath that everyday murmur, there was a silence that didn't answer. It sat under town gossip, under late-night theories, under the ranger's lists, and it waited. Not loud, not dramatic, just patient. The land did what land does. It kept its secrets, folded them into roots and dust, watched seasons make and erase the evidence of us. For now, there was only waiting, and a photograph on a phone that chimed in the dark. Historic in its ordinary finality. A tent under a pine, a man who liked the quiet, and a last caption that promised a return that never came. They widened the search slowly, the way you peel an orange, layer by layer, careful not to miss the sweet center. Rangers expanded the grid, helicopters skimmed the ridge at dawn until their blades blurred the horizon, and volunteers padded through scrub with flashlights that made the world look like a photograph being developed in real time. Every morning the town woke to the same ritual: coffee, gear checks, a quick nod, and the low hum of people pretending this would be routine. It never was. At first, the evidence lay thin and stubborn. A boot lay snagged in a juniper. A folded map with one corner damp, as if someone had left it by the creek and the moss pressed moisture into paper. A thermos, half full of coffee gone cold in the shade of the pine. Little human things that still suggested presence. Small signs of a life paused, not ended. Those objects kept hope alive like a slow-burning candle. Maybe he'd left a trail, maybe he'd wandered off to find a signal, maybe he'd met someone who offered help. Everyone wanted it to be something ordinary, but the ordinary kept slipping away. Tracks faded into wind-polished stone. A jacket discovered caught between branches had no pockets turned out, no wallet, no ID. Dogs trained to lock onto the scent found roots that bent and then dissolved, like someone had walked through fog. Rangers traced patterns until their fingers cramped, marking circles on maps, connecting dots that refused to make a picture. Each theory, animal attack, robbery, misadventure, met a counterpoint. There was no clawing, no obvious fight, no blood soaked into the earth. That absence became an accusation. Around town, conversations changed. In the feed store, while buying rope or rabbit feed, people whispered in ways that pretended not to be whispering. "He was a loner, right?" someone would say, and another would sigh. "Lucky it isn't one of us." At the bar, over cheap beer, men speculated about hikers who got lost and never came back. A woman at the laundromat folded towels and told a neighbor, "Kids think they can conquer nature. Nature writes its own rules." There were stories that softened the harshness, of someone starting fresh in another state, of a lover who took him away. But they were thin, like tissue paper. You could see the truth through them. As weeks telescoped into months, an odd thing happened. The place where Ethan had disappeared began to gather meaning beyond the missing man. The pine at the clearing developed a presence. People who passed would pause, not out of superstition at first, but because the tree seemed to hold a weight of its own. Locals swore it stood differently, its roots more pronounced, its bark scarred in a new way, details you might not notice unless you looked for them. Some attributed it to seasons. Others felt an unnamed shift. Children dared one another to touch the trunk. Teenagers told jokes and then hurried away, breathless and a little ashamed. Rangers logged calls that drifted between useful and odd. An elderly couple swore they heard a radio static where there should be silence. A hunter reported that his compass spun for a moment while he crossed the washed-out trail. One time, a pair of hikers came back with wet shoes and no memory of crossing a creek. They said they'd simply stepped through a patch of fog and then found themselves on the other bank. The ranger who received those reports, the same one who kept Ethan's name in a neat stack on his desk, frowned and wrote notes. He never laughed off what he heard, but he also never gave it too much air. Professionals often balance curiosity with restraint. It's how they stay anchored. Community meetings became small theaters for grief and argument. People stood and offered suggestions, flyers, rewards, reward matching, more volunteers. But there were also quieter moments. An aunt admitting she blamed herself for telling him to go take pictures on a whim. A neighbor muttering that maybe the forest took him because it wanted to keep something. The words were strange, hedged with superstition, but they carried sincerity. The ranger tried to steer conversations back to facts, search schedules, last known coordinates, volunteer lists, while an undercurrent of something else kept pulling at the edges, something that made folks glance over their shoulders on their way home. There were practical frustrations. The sheriff's office said resources were strained. Other cases demanded helicopters, budgets, manpower. Volunteers burned out. Good people who found the hills harder and the answers thinner than they'd imagined. The seasonal storms scrubbed tracks clean. Animals moved through with the indifference of their kind, erasing signs. And with every washed-out track, every stale lead, the town's patience wore thinner. People argued about whether to keep searching or to let the landscape be. They fought in the comment threads of the local news, they argued in parking lots, they murmured in line at the supermarket. These were small social weather systems, storms of opinion that did their own kind of damage. But beneath the procedural grind and public chatter, a quieter, persistent thing grew. A sense that the place where Ethan vanished was not like other places. Hunters reported small oddities, birds circling and then dropping away, a silence that descended like a curtain at dusk, an animal refusing to cross the clearing. Hikers spoke about an appetite in the landscape, subtle and patient. The ranger, older now and less certain, began to spend longer at the map table, tracing lines with a finger and pausing as if listening for something beneath the paper. He developed a habit of rubbing his thumb along the printed coordinates, as though trying to feel a pulse. At night, the town held itself together with small rituals. His sister would look at the last photo and whisper to friends, "He loved that place," and the words carried both pride and accusation. She tossed in and out of hope, dreams of a mistake, of an accident, fear of a darker answer. Friends would turn their heads and offer practical help, search parties, flyers, but the emotional work of waiting was solitary. The longer time went, the more that waiting began to feel like a room with no windows, familiar but claustrophobic. And so the vanishing point did its slow work. It shifted from an investigation into a wound, one that the town touched gingerly, sometimes with anger, sometimes with denial, sometimes with guilt. People kept living, marriages continued, breakfasts were eaten, Kids went to school. Yet on certain days, when the wind cut the same way it had the weekend Ethan left, voices hushed and hands found pockets. The clearing remained, stubborn and quiet, and its silence grew teeth. No one said anything dramatic. No one screamed in the street, but in the spaces between town gossip and official reports, something had changed, subtle, patient, and impossible to explain away. The place kept its secrets, and the people kept their questions. It was supposed to be just another weekend hike. Late summer, 6 years after Ethan Cole's name stopped appearing in headlines and faded into small talk. Two hikers, a couple from Carson City, were exploring a dried creek bed off-trail, following a string of stones that glittered like glass under the Nevada sun. They were laughing, recording videos, tossing pebbles into hollow trunks. Then something made them stop. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like an interruption, a shift in the rhythm of the forest. The air there had weight. No birdsong, no rustle, just a thick pause that pressed against their ears. The woman squinted at the ground. "That looks like bone," she said half-jokingly. The man laughed, crouched down, brushed away dirt with his hand, and the laughter died halfway through his breath. A pale curve peeked from the soil, too clean to be driftwood, too round to be stone. He touched it. It was cool, dry, almost polished. They knelt, scraping softly until the rest appeared. Ribs, a spine, fingers curled under the earth like they were still holding on to something. The bones were arranged, not scattered like nature usually does. They formed a shape, deliberate, respectful, horrifying. When the first ranger arrived, the couple was sitting on a rock, silent, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles looked bruised. The woman whispered, "We didn't touch anything after that. We just didn't." She didn't have to explain why. The team marked the site. They took photographs, the kind of photographs that make you believe in curses. The bones were partly buried beneath the roots of an enormous pine that had grown thicker since anyone had last been there. The roots wound over and through the skeleton, gentle but possessive, as though the earth had claimed what was left and decided to keep it. When they lifted the skull, a sliver of root still clung to the jawbone, a thin thread of brown fiber that pulsed faintly with sap. A forensic tech blinked, swore quietly, and backed away. "It's alive?" she murmured. Nobody answered. News spread fast, even in a town that had learned to forget. By sunset, reporters were leaning on car hoods outside the ranger station, lights flashing, microphones catching dust. Locals drifted in, pretending to refill gas or buy snacks, then lingered near the door to listen. One man muttered, "Told y'all the forest don't just take." A woman crossing her arms said, "Could have been anyone's bones. Y'all just love a ghost story." And someone near the window whispered, "You remember that photographer? The one who disappeared up there?" Inside, the ranger who had led the original search sat behind a desk, jaw tight, the years of paperwork collapsing into one long exhale. He stared at the photographs, his thumb tapping against the corner of the image. Ribs intertwined with tree roots, vertebrae fused into bark. It looked wrong, but not random. It looked like intent. When the dental records came back, they confirmed what everyone already knew but didn't want to admit. The remains belonged to Ethan Cole, the same man whose camera had been found years ago, half buried near the stream. The town changed overnight. Conversations felt heavier, pauses longer. People who once blamed Ethan for recklessness now whispered apologies in parking lots. His sister came back for the identification, stood before the ranger's desk and said softly, "I knew he was still out there." She didn't cry, not right away. She pressed her palms together, stared at the photos again, and whispered, "He was always part of nature, I guess." But the ranger saw her hands shaking, the way someone shakes when they're cold but standing in the sun. When the forensic team tried to exhume the bones for examination, something strange happened. The soil resisted. Not metaphorically, it literally refused. Shovels sank only an inch before striking roots, thick and tangled like cables. Every cut exposed more of them, glistening with sap. They weren't rotting. They were alive. The crew brought saws. The saws broke. Someone joked about it. Guess he didn't want to leave. But nobody laughed. By evening, they managed to retrieve part of the skeleton, a single femur, one arm bone, the skull. Under the lab lights, the story grew darker. The bones weren't normal anymore. They had texture, growths, layers of something plant-like fused into calcium. When a tech sliced a thin piece for testing, sap bled from the marrow. Real, amber-colored sap. One of the forensic specialists, a woman from Las Vegas who'd worked on desert decomposition studies for 15 years, stared at it for a long time and said, "Bones can't do this. They don't merge with trees." Yet somehow, Ethan's had. Back in town, gossip evolved into folklore. Kids whispered that if you touched that pine after sunset, you could hear breathing. Truck drivers passing the ridge said their headlights dimmed for no reason. A man who went hunting nearby claimed the forest hummed, a sound that vibrated in his chest like a heartbeat. The ranger didn't sleep much after that. He drove up to the site alone one night, parked near the taped-off clearing, and just listened. The air was still, colder than it should have been. He stepped closer to the pine, boots sinking into the soft ground. The bark seemed to ripple in the moonlight. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it wasn't. He whispered, "Ethan." No answer, but a drop of sap slid down the bark, catching light like a tear. He backed away, muttering a nervous laugh, shaking his head like a man who doesn't want to believe what he just saw. As he turned to leave, he thought he heard something faint. A whisper, maybe just wind between roots, that sounded like someone breathing out the word, "wait." He didn't go back after that. When morning came, the ranger filed his report with hands that trembled, noting, "Remains discovered, location cordoned, root system anomalous. Recommend closure of area until further study." And so they did. They closed off the forest. No entry, no camping, no hiking. But that didn't stop people from sneaking in. They always do. A month later, another hiker claimed the pine had grown taller. Another said the roots were spreading. And by winter, locals swore they'd seen a face in the bark. Not clear, just enough to haunt you when you tried to sleep. The bones had been found, but the question that haunted everyone was simple. What found them first? By the time fall rolled in, the Nevada woods felt heavier, quieter. Even the wind seemed cautious, gliding around the trees instead of through them. Most locals avoided the place now. They said the forest had changed, like it didn't want visitors anymore. But not everyone listened. In 2021, a group of hikers from Reno stumbled into those same woods. They weren't looking for trouble, just a good trail and maybe a few photos. The air was cool that morning, crisp enough to sting their lungs a little. A thick mist hung low, curling between the trunks like ghostly smoke. They followed an old ranger path, laughing, sharing snacks, the way people do when they still trust the world. Until one of them, Megan, noticed something sticking out of the soil near a cluster of pine roots. She thought it was a branch at first, but when she brushed the dirt away with her boot, the shape was wrong. Too smooth, too round, a skull. The laughter stopped. Nobody said a word, but every heartbeat in that circle grew louder. They called the sheriff's department immediately. Within hours, the quiet forest that had been untouched for years came alive with blue lights, camera flashes, and the low hum of generators. The forensics team moved carefully, unearthing what time had swallowed. The bones were scattered, but intact enough to tell one thing. This wasn't an accident. Sheriff Randall knelt by the excavation site, gloved hands steady. He'd been a rookie when David disappeared, and the case had haunted him since. Now, looking at the bones, he knew deep down. He'd found what was left of him. But then came the detail that froze every single person there. Carved into the femur were symbols. Not random scratches, not animal marks. Symbols. Perfectly etched, clean lines, looping into patterns no one could understand. Some looked ancient, others almost mathematical. One of the deputies whispered, "Looks like someone marked him." The coroner didn't argue. She'd seen a lot, but nothing like that. The cuts were deliberate, done post-mortem, as if whoever did it wanted to send a message. News spread fast, faster than wildfire through sagebrush. Within a day, the small town was buzzing again, just like 6 years earlier. Only this time, people weren't talking about a missing man. They were talking about what had been done to him. Two old men at the diner were whispering over coffee. "See? I told you something out there ain't right." "Or someone," the other replied, eyes fixed on the woods outside the window. Even the locals who used to mock David's obsession with the legends now spoke softer when his name came up. Because suddenly, the old stories didn't sound so ridiculous anymore. Meanwhile, investigators tried to decode the markings. The symbols didn't match any known alphabets or religious iconography. But one expert from the University of Nevada said they resembled a hybrid of ancient runes and geometric inscriptions, the kind used in old esoteric societies. And then, buried beneath a collapsed tent, they found something else. A metal compass. Rusted, but still readable. On the back, faintly engraved, were the initials DH. That was the confirmation everyone dreaded. The remains belonged to David Harper. The sheriff stood in silence as they loaded the evidence. His voice cracked when he finally said, "After all these years, we found him." But what none of them noticed was the tree just a few yards away. On its bark, barely visible through the moss, someone had carved a new set of the same strange symbols, fresh, clean, and sharp. Like someone had been there recently, and watching. When word got out that the bones in the Nevada woods were David Harper's, the story spread beyond the town. National news, podcasts, even YouTubers dissecting every detail. For most people, it was a tragic mystery, finally solved. But for those who lived near the forest, it didn't feel solved at all. It felt unfinished, like the woods had only given back what it didn't need anymore. Sheriff Randall knew that feeling better than anyone. The night after the recovery, he sat alone in his truck, parked on the edge of the forest line. The headlights glowed weakly against the trees. He could hear the night breathing, wind sighing through the pines, something shifting in the brush. He'd been to that spot hundreds of times, but this time, it felt like the forest was watching him. He turned the radio up just to break the silence, but it didn't help. The static between songs almost sounded like whispers. He shook his head, muttering, "Get a grip, man." The autopsy confirmed what he already knew but didn't want to face. David hadn't died from exposure or an animal attack. The cause of death was blunt trauma to the skull, likely from a human strike. Whoever did it had carved those symbols after. But why? And who out here would do something so precise, so ritualistic? A week later, the sheriff called in Dr. Helena Knox, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Utah who specialized in obscure symbology. She arrived quiet and observant, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. After spending hours studying the carvings, she said softly, "These markings, they're not random. They form a cycle, like a repeating seal. This one," she pointed to a swirl inside a triangle, "represents binding. Whoever carved this wanted to trap something, or keep something in." Randall frowned. "Keep what in?" Helena didn't answer right away. She just looked up at the tree photos from the crime scene, the fresh carvings. The question isn't what they were trying to keep in, but what they accidentally let out. Meanwhile, the townspeople grew restless again. At the bar, a pair of locals whispered near the jukebox, "Man, that forest's cursed. Always has been." "You think Harper found something? Maybe woke it up?" "Nah, he didn't wake it up. He fed it." People started claiming they saw lights moving between the trees at night. Others said they heard humming, like a low vibration, coming from deep within the woods. It wasn't loud, just enough to make you stop and wonder if your ears were playing tricks on you. Randall tried to ignore the rumors until one night, he went back to the site himself. No cameras, no crew, just him and a flashlight. The ground was scarred where the excavation had been, and the air smelled like damp soil and something metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust. He shined the light over the bark of that same tree, the one with the new carvings. Only now, there were more. Lines that hadn't been there before, twisting into new shapes, circling around the old ones like something was still being written. The sheriff froze. His breath hitched as the beam caught movement behind him. Faint, slow, deliberate. He spun, flashlight trembling, and for a split second he saw it. A shadow in the mist, tall, thin, motionless. But the shape didn't move like a man. It seemed to sway like it was part of the trees. He stumbled back, heart hammering, flashlight flickering. By the time he steadied it, the figure was gone. Only silence. Only that faint smell of earth and iron. He left the woods that night and never went back. A month later, a small memorial was held for David Harper. His sister cried quietly as they lowered a simple wooden box into the ground. No one spoke of the carvings. No one mentioned the symbols. But when she placed a single photograph of David on the grave, a smiling shot of him holding his old compass, she noticed something carved faintly into the headstone's edge, a single triangle, with a swirl inside it. She brushed her fingers over it, confused, then turned to look toward the tree line in the distance. For a moment, she thought she saw someone standing there, a pale outline in the shadow of the pines, watching. Then it was gone. In the years since, people still talk about David Harper. Some say he was just another hiker who got lost. Others whisper he found something he shouldn't have, something that didn't want to be found. And if you walk far enough into those Nevada woods, you'll still find that tree. The carvings are older now, deeper, weathered by wind and rain. But the strange part? Every year, a new one appears, fresh, sharp, like someone's still out there continuing the message. Or maybe, just maybe, the forest is writing it by itself. If you think David Harper's story ended with his bones being found, think again. Something still moves in those Nevada woods, and every year, it carves another mark like it's keeping count. So tell me, would you step into those trees after dark? Follow for more chilling true stories that'll keep you up tonight.